Hey guys, Uncommon Ramen here with another TCG Tuesday. Before we jump into our next deck tech, which is again going to be a commander deck tech for Firesong and Sunspeaker this time, I would like to mention that if you like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe, and hit that bell icon if you want to see notifications for more content as I post it. And also, if you feel the need to support me, please hit me up on my Patreon page at patreon.com/uncommonramen, capital U, capital R. I do all this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you. So now, without further ado, we're going to jump into this Firesong and Sunspeaker commander decks as Boros colors. It's an inspiration from the deck that Josh Lee Kwai played on Command Zone, but there is some big differences here, and we'll jump into it as we go. First, we're going to take a look at the commander, which is Firesong and Sunspeaker. This is a commander that you would have gotten as a box topper for buying a box of Dominaria during that release time anyway. It is for a red and a white. Red instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink, and whenever a white instant or sorcery spell causes you to gain life, Firesong and Sunspeaker deals 3 damage to target creature or player. So, one of my friends that I play Commander with dubbed this a Boros Spellslinger, and while at first I thought that was kind of an inaccurate title, it actually is pretty accurate. There are a heavy amount of spells in here, especially in the realm of instants and sorceries, and it's pretty thin on most things besides that, or at least it definitely... we take a lot of slots from other cards to put instants and sorceries in here. So it's a little lighter on creatures, a little lighter on artifacts, but it does have quite a few really great enchantments, so we're just going to jump in. The first thing we're going to look at is the creatures. Okay, let me pull those off. So based off of what the commander does, what you're trying to do is maximize the amount of red spells that are lifelinking, and really try and bolster your life total to get some interesting win conditions via things like Aetherflux Reservoir and stuff like that. So we'll go into it right now. For the first creature, we have Boros Reckoner. This can be 3 red or 3 white, or a combination thereof. Whenever Boros Reckoner is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target. And for a red-white hybrid, it can gain first strike until end of turn. This is really just meant to be on the table, to maybe do some incidental blocking in the early part of the game. But really, you want to blow it up with a board wipe spell and have it deal that damage to target player of your choice, or any target really for that matter. And essentially it just helps you gain that much more life. Next up, we have Brash Taunter. It's fairly similar. Brash Taunter is a 1/1 for 5. It has Indestructible, and that's a big difference here. And whenever Brash Taunter is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent. So we're not doing it to any target, we're doing it only to target opponent, but we're trading out the lack of Indestructible for Indestructible, so this thing lives through whatever damage spells you're throwing at it. And then for 2 and a red, you can tap it to fight another creature. So you can force it to get damage dealt to it, so you can deal it back to whichever opponent you choose. And again, this is just really, it's a body on the table for incidental blocking, and when it soaks up damage, it just reflects that damage. And because it's indestructible, you have to jump through hoops to kind of kill it. Next, we have Esper Sentinel. White decks have a difficulty with draw power, and Esper Sentinel is just a phenomenal draw card. It can be a target, but a lot of people don't want to waste spot removal on something so small, but it will eventually get killed. For 1 white and a 1/1 body, whenever your opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, you get to draw a card unless they pay X, where X is the power. So you can buff it up if you want them to pay more, but essentially it comes down to they pay 1 if they play their first spell to keep you from drawing. Next up, we have Felidar Sovereign. This is one of the alternate win conditions here. For 4 and 2 white, it has Vigilance and Lifelink, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 40 or more life, you win the game. It's a 4/6 body, so it's formidable, but it is also a target, so your opponents are going to, when that hits the table, see what it does and try and kill it immediately. Otherwise, you will win the game. The idea here is to lifelink out some big mana spells and get a whole lot of health, and then play this and pretty much win the game. We got Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. This one is a spicy card for a lot of reasons. It costs 7 for a 5/5 flying first strike, but if a source would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, that source deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. And if a source would deal damage to you or a permanent you control, prevent half of that damage rounded up. So we're preventing a whole lot of damage to us, which means our opponents have to work much harder, in this case twice as hard, to kill us. And we're doubling up damage, not just from our sources, but from our opponent's sources if they're being dealt to other opponents. So if I'm playing a 3-player game and my opponent to my left attacks my opponent to my right, this will trigger their creatures to deal double damage to that opponent. It's just a really nuts card. It should be in any Boros deck of this caliber, because it really just helps to tie together the game very quickly. Next up, we have Gutter Snipe. It's a pretty simple card, 3 for a 2/2. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. And since we're casting instant and sorceries as kind of the crux of this deck, the idea is to just kind of ping away at your opponent slowly but surely. We have Mungara the Diplomat. It's 4 for a 2/4 lifelink. Whenever an opponent attacks you with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you, or a planeswalker you control, you get to draw a card. And then whenever your opponent casts their second spell each turn, you get to draw a card. So we're getting a card draw off of getting attacked. We're getting a card draw off the second spell being cast. So if you have Esper Sentinel in play, you get a card draw possibly from the first non-creature spell they cast, and then Mangara allows you to draw a card after the second spell they cast. So it's just more of that draw synergy that this deck really, really needs. Next, we have Neheb the Eternal. He has a Flicked 3, so whenever this creature becomes blocked, defending player loses 3 life. So we're already plinking away at them that way. And then at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you add red mana to your mana pool for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So you can open up with either a really crucial attack, or open up with a red spell that, let's say a red board wipe that deals immense amount of damage to players as well, like for instance like Earthquake or something to that effect. And then during your secondary combat phase, you'll get a whole bunch of red mana equal to the amount of life that was lost by your opponents, and then just recast another large, horrible spell. It's just a really good card in here for mana. Then we have Radiant Scroll Wielder. It is a 2/4 for 4. Instant and sorcery spells you control have lifelink, so it shares that with Firesong and Sunspeaker, except that it's every instant and sorcery as opposed to red instant and sorceries. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you can exile an instant or sorcery card at random from your graveyard, and then you may cast that card this turn. If a spell was cast this way from the graveyard, exile it instead. So it'll give your instant and sorcery cards that are in your graveyard already flashback, which allows you to recast them, which is just super powerful, and especially when we're looking to try and get as much life as possible. Next, we have Rem Carulus, Stalwart Slayer. This is a 3 for a 2/3 flying haste. If a spell would deal damage to you or another permanent you control, prevent that damage. And if a spell would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent opponent controls, it deals that much damage +1. So we're increasing the amount of damage of the spells we're dealing to our opponent, which is for free, basically. And then we're also preventing that damage happening to us. So for our large suite of board wipes in the form of like Earthquake, Star of Extinction, Blasphemous Act, stuff like that, Rem protects your other creatures from taking that damage. So if you put things like Darksteel Plate on Rem, suddenly your creatures are, for the most part, indestructible unless your opponents really jump through hoops to do so. Next up, we have Solemn Simulacrum. 4 for a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can search for a basic land card and put it on the battlefield tapped, and then when it dies, you draw a card. So it's in here for the ramp. Obviously, red-white has a very difficult time ramping, so anything that we can get in here that will help us ramp is just absolutely necessary. And then, of course, when it dies, you get to draw a card. And in this deck, since we're going to be doing damage to pretty much all creatures, it'll die probably pretty quickly. And even if it doesn't die from your own spells, you can block to kill it and get that card draw. Next, we have Stuffy Doll. Stuffy Doll's a kind of a jerk move in this deck. It is indestructible 0/1. As it enters the battlefield, you choose a player. And whenever Stuffy Doll is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to the chosen player. So it's very similar to the Brash Taunter and the Boros Reckoner, except that when it comes into play, you choose which player is going to take that damage. And as long as Stuffy Doll remains in play, it's going to continuously deal that damage to your whichever player you chose. It's a good way to pretty much put a death sentence on one of your opponents. And then you can also just tap the Stuffy Doll to deal 1 damage to itself, so you can get like one little poke in with it. Next, we have Toralf, God of Fury. We're using it for the Toralf, God of Fury side because it is a 4 for a 5/4 trample, but what we really like here is whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls is dealt excess non-combat damage, Toralf deals damage equal to the excess to any target other than that permanent. So if we go with a Blasphemous Act, now our Blasphemous Act is going to deal an exact amount of damage to each creature, and then any rollover damage, you could just aim at your opponent's heads, and it can possibly do quite a bit of damage there. Again, it's not protected, so you're going to want to throw things like Darksteel Plate or have Rem in play or Mark of Asylum, something like that to keep your creature alive. But as long as it is alive, it treats spells that deal extra damage like they have trample, basically. Next, we have Torbran, Thane of Redfell, 4 for a 2/4. If a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent, or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. So we're just getting a free +2 on top of whatever damage we're doing, and it's just a really deadly thing to have around. And then lastly, we have Treasonous Ogre, 4 for a 2/3. It has Dethrone, so whenever this creature attacks, the player with the most life or tied for most life, it gets +1/+1 counter on it. And then you can pay 3 life to add 1 red mana to your mana pool. Again, we are life-linking our spells, so we're trying to get as much HP as possible. And then you can just sink that HP into Treasonous Ogre 3 life at a time to get any amount of red mana you need to do even more damage. It's just a really great card in this deck. Next up, we're going to take a look at the instants. There are quite a few instants in here, and for that matter, quite a few sorceries. So this is the meat of the deck, is the instants and sorceries. So first off, one thing is, I don't think we have anything. I guess that's not true. We have 2 full white ones. The rest of these are going to be red, white, or just plain red. Starting with Aurelius Fury. Aurelius Fury deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or players. Tap each creature that is dealt damage this way. Players dealt damage this way can't cast non-creature spells this turn. So it acts like a silence in a sense if you deal damage to a player, at least for a turn, and it can spread the damage over numerous amounts of creatures. So it's kind of a mock board wipe without being a board wipe. The X cost in here isn't a big deal because we're trying to do big mana here. There's a lot of different ways to get a lot of mana really quickly in this deck. So for Aurelius Fury to come out really in a really high power mode, it's possible to do so. And then, of course, because it's red, it's going to get that lifelink from Firesong and Sunspeaker. Next, we have Boros Charm. Boros Charm is just an absolutely incredible card. I would say if you're running Boros, you're going to have to run Boros Charm. It deals 4 damage to every player or planeswalker if you choose that mode, which is great for this deck because, again, our red spells get lifelink, and it's a white spell, so it's going to do, on Firesong Sunspeaker, the extra 3 damage, so 7 damage for 2 is really great. And then its secondary mode is permanents you control gain indestructible until end of turn. So if we really need to protect our creatures, this is a fantastic way to do so. And then finally, target creature gains double strike until end of turn, which if it becomes an incidental, I need to swing in to win the game, this can help you do that. Next, we have Comet Storm. Comet Storm is X into red with multi-kicker 1. Choose any target, then choose another target for each time the spell was kicked. Comet Storm deals X damage to each of them. So again, we're maximizing the red spell lifelink idea here, and dealing as much damage to as many targets as possible to gain as much life as possible. Then we have Deflecting Palm, 2 for the next time a source of your choice would deal damage to you this turn, prevent that damage. If the damage is prevented this way, Deflecting Palm deals that much damage to that source's controller. So we can prevent damage from a creature, possibly a big creature, or from a spell, especially if your opponents are playing a big X spell against you, and then turn around and deal it right back to them, which is, again, right along the lines of what this deck wants to do. Then we have Electro Dominance, X and 2 red. It deals X damage to any target, and then you can cast a card with converted mana cost X or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So we get something out into play for free, and we get to deal the X damage. And if we have Sunspeaker in play, we get that lifelink, and it's just a really great card. We have Heliod's Intervention in here for mass destruction of artifacts and/or enchantments, but you can also use it to gain a huge amount of life. So let's say we have the Aetherflux Reservoir or the Felidar Sovereign in play. This is a great way to bolster the life total to make it even harder for your opponents to stop you from winning. Next, we have Increasing Vengeance, 2 red to copy an instant or sorcery spell that you control. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, copy the spell twice instead. And you may choose new targets for the copies, and it has flashback 3 and 2 red. There are quite a few things in here with flashback, not to mention we have the Radiant Scroll Wielder. So Increasing Vengeance has the possibility pretty early on of getting a triple copy of something, and it just makes it really great for this deck. Again, when we're trying to put big X spells out there, the more copies of it, the more life we're going to get. So Increasing Vengeance, very good. Then we have Lightning Bolt, pretty simple. 1 red, deal 3 damage to any target. Again, red spell, gain life, very good, and it's fantastic spot removal. We have Lightning Helix, red-white. Lightning Helix deals 3 damage to any target, and you gain 3 life. So with Firesong and Sunspeaker in play, you're actually going to gain 6 life and deal 6 damage with it. So it's just a fantastic card for 2. Path to Exile, another pretty simple one. For 1 white, you exile target creature, and its controller gets to search its library for a basic land and put it into play. Very good spot removal. Probably one of the best up there with Swords to Plowshares, which I don't have in here, ironically, but I could make space for it. Just super good spot removal. Next, we have Price of Progress. Everyone who's playing Commander is going to be running non-basic lands, and a lot of the time they're running quite a few non-basic lands. When you look up a lot of strategies behind building decks for Commander, they really heavily lean on the idea of running as many non-basics as you can for a lot of reasons. Fixing is a good mana fixing is a good reason for it. Utility is also a great reason for it. So Price of Progress has a chance of doing a lot of damage, which it deals damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands that player controls, for 2, and again with Sunspeaker in play, it has lifelink, so we're going to gain some amount of life from that. Next, we have Reverberate, 2 red, copy an target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. It's just another version of Fork, basically, and it's not as useful as, say, what was that other one? Increasing Vengeance, but it's still pretty darn good. Next up, we have Sacred Fire. Deals 2 damage to any target, and you gain 2 life. And it has flashback, and it costs 1 red and 1 white. So again, with Firesong and Sunspeaker, we're actually going to be gaining something like 4 life, and we're going to be dealing 5 damage for 2. I mean, that's pretty darn good. Next up, we have Starstorm. Starstorm, I think, is actually... No, it's not the last one. Starstorm is X and 2 red. It deals X damage to each creature, and it has cycling for 3. So essentially, the X damage to each creature is what really makes this incredible. So you can dump 8 mana into this, and if there's, let's say, 9 creatures on the table, you've just gained nearly 80 life right there from Firesong and Sunspeaker. So it's just a really phenomenal way of getting that bolstered life. And then lastly, we have War Leader's Helix. I think that's last, yeah. It deals 4 damage to target creature or player, and you gain 4 life. And again, this is more like 8 life and 7 damage for 4. So just really fantastic cards in this deck. Next, we're going to take a look at the Sorceries. And again, the meat of the deck is the Sorceries in Instance. We have a really good set of enchantments in here, but really, we're focusing on the Sorceries in Instance. So, right from the get-go, we have Blasphemous Act, deals 13 damage to each creature, and it costs 1 less for each creature on the battlefield. So this thing can cost as little as 1 red, and it deals 13 damage to everything. With Firesong and Sunspeaker in play, that 13 damage can easily bring your life total ridiculously high, depending on how many creatures are actually in play. Next, we have Chain Reaction. Chain Reaction deals X damage to each creature, where X is the number of creatures on the battlefield. And it's the same thing here. Basically, what we want to do is cast that to get big life. And it also wipes the field. The big part of all of this is that we're not only going to gain a huge amount of life, but we're also going to try and wipe the field completely to make it even easier for us to stay in the game. Then we have Deafening Clarion. You can choose one or both. Deafening Clarion does 3 damage to each creature, or creatures you control gain lifelink. So we're doubling up on the ability to get some life gain here with the lifelink, but also the 3 damage to each creature. You might kill quite a few creatures, and on top of that, with Sunspeaker and Firesong and Sunspeaker in play, you're going to gain 3 life for each creature that got dealt damage. Earthquake. Same thing, again, we're dealing X damage to each creature without flying and each player, and then we're, with Firesong and Sunspeaker in play, going to gain all of that life back. We got Hour of Devastation. All creatures lose indestructible until end of turn, and then Hour of Devastation deals 5 damage to each of those, each creature and each non-Bolas Planeswalker. So we get rid of indestructible, that's the first part. It can deal damage to planeswalkers, that's the second part. So not only can we wipe out a whole bunch of creatures, we could possibly maybe not wipe out, but get very close to wiping out planeswalkers that are sitting on the table that might be causing issues. And then we're, with Firesong and Sunspeaker in play, going to gain life equal to that amount of damage being dealt. It's just a phenomenal card. Then we got Jaya's Immolating Inferno. Unfortunately, you can only play this if you have a legendary creature in play, and there's quite a few in here, obviously your commander being the main one. But when you do, it deals X damage to each of up to 3 targets. So again, just bolstering that life total and getting rid of cards on the table. Then we have Jessica's Will. If you have a commander in play, you can choose both, otherwise you choose one. Add red mana for each card in target opponent's hand, and then exile top 3 cards of your library. You can play them this turn. So this is really phenomenal in this deck, especially if you're playing somebody who keeps their hand at 7 or higher. When people are running things like Reliquary Tower or, oh gosh, what was that mana rock that made it so you didn't have to? Either way, what I'm saying is, if you have somebody who's playing something that says that they no longer have a hand size, this is going to be even more powerful in your hands. More importantly, we have so many ways to double up on an instant or sorcery. We have things like Reverberate, and we have things like Increasing Vengeance, but we also have Pyromancer's Goggles, and so any of these methods can be used to make this thing basically to copy it and to get extremely large amounts of mana very quickly, and this is what this deck wants to do. More importantly, we also have is it Breach the Underworld, I think is what it's called, an enchantment that basically lets you put escape on all your cards, so you can escape this from your graveyard to cast it again. So we're just kind of abusing the fact that we get huge amounts of mana, and then we're exiling a bunch of cards so that we can play those and possibly end the game at that point. So Jessica's Will is incredible. Then we have Mana Geyser. For 5, you add 1 red mana to your mana pool for each tapped land your opponents control. If you're playing a 4-player game, your opponents are going to have a ton of lands tapped, unless, of course, they're playing, blue or blue-black and holding back for responses. Needless to say, you should be able to get quite a bit of mana from this, and that's what we're trying to do. Again, get big mana, dump it into a spell, deal a whole bunch of damage. We got Mizium Mortars. For 1 and a red, it deals 4 damage to target creature you don't control. And you can choose to overload this for 3 and 3 red to deal 4 damage to each creature you don't control. And again, just hitting that lifelink with the Firesong Sunspeaker to really bolster your life total. Then we have Molten Disaster. Molten Disaster is X and 2 red with kicker red. If Molten Disaster was kicked, it has split second, which basically means it cannot be interacted with once it's played. It basically stops the stack right there. And it deals X damage to each creature without flying in each player. Then we have Rip Apart. Red and white, choose one. Rip Apart deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, or destroy target artifact or enchantment. It's just really versatile spot removal. So if you have an artifact or enchantment in play that you don't want, or your opponent has one in play that you don't want in play, you can get rid of it. Otherwise, you can use it to deal damage to a creature or planeswalker and then gain the life back with Sunspeaker and Firesong. Then we have Rolling Earthquake, deals X damage to each creature without horsemanship and each player. And since there are not a whole lot of creatures with horsemanship, you're pretty much going to hit everything on the table. Then we have Star of Extinction, 7, destroy target land, and Star of Extinction deals 20 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. Again, I can't tell you how incredibly important that is with Sunspeaker and Firesong and Sunspeaker in play. Then lastly, we have Wheel of Misfortune. Wheel of Misfortune is definitely better when you have Firesong and Sunspeaker in play, but even if you don't have it in play, this is a great way to change up a hand that maybe isn't working for you. Each player secretly chooses a number 0 or greater, then all players reveal those numbers simultaneously and determine the highest and lowest numbers revealed this way. Wheel of Misfortune deals damage equal to the highest number to each player who chose that number, and each player who didn't choose the lowest number discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. So whoever drew the lowest number does nothing. Whoever drew the in-between numbers discards their hand and draws 7. And whoever drew the highest number takes damage equal to that number, then discards their cards and draws 7. So it's a great kind of wheel, if you will. Obviously it's a wheel. But more importantly, that damage that it deals, so if your opponent chose a number that was higher than yours and they take the damage, Firesong and Sunspeaker sees that, and it has lifelink at that point. So you would gain that much life. So it's just a really interesting, cool card to have in here. Next, we're going to take a look at the artifacts, which include the rocks. Starting with Aetherflux Reservoir. With as much damage as we're dealing with lifelink red spells, the amount of life we're going to be gaining helps to really fuel Aetherflux Reservoir, bringing it from being just one of those cards that's going to give you one kill switch for an opponent to possibly giving you enough to take out an entire table of opponents, because you're going to gain huge amounts of life if left unchecked. Not to mention, Aetherflux Reservoir itself has its own life gain ability. Whenever you cast a spell, you gain a life for each other spell that you've cast that turn. And then, of course, the pay 50 life to deal 50 damage to target creature or player. Next up, we have Arcane Signet, 2 to tap for a color identity. Boros Signet, 2 to filter for red-white. Commander Sphere, 3, you can add a mana from your to your color identity, and you can sacrifice to draw a card. Darksteel Plate is indestructible, and it gives the creature that it's equipped to indestructible as well. So this is something that you want to put on Rem or the Boros Reckoner, something that you need to stay in play that's also giving you a blanket to help keep your creatures alive. Lightning Greaves, this is to protect Firesong and Sunspeaker. Mindstone, 2 for 1, and you can sacrifice to draw a card. Primal Amulet is in here for a couple reasons. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you're going to put a counter on it, and if there are 4 more counters, it transforms. Also, instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. That's really great for X spells because that's just 1 extra damage that it's dealing that you didn't have to pay for. And then again, it transforms. So let me pull that off the screen. So it transforms into Primal Wellspring, which you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and then when that mana is spent to cast an instant or sorcery spell, you get to copy that spell and choose new targets for it, which is phenomenal for this deck. So just a really great card, Primal Amulet. I'll show that on there again. And then next up we have Pyromancer's Goggles. I was talking about these earlier. You can tap it to add, for 5, you can... it comes into play for 5. You can tap it to add a red mana to your mana pool, and when that mana is spent to cast a red instant or sorcery spell, you copy it, and you can choose new targets for the copy. So again, very similar to the land that Primal Amulet turns into, and just deadly in this deck. Next we have Soul Ring, 1 for 2. Then we have Sunforger, I believe that... no, not the last one. Sunforger is an equipment for 3 that equips for 3 as well. Equipped creature gets +4/+0, but that's not really the kicker here. The kicker here is for 1 red and 1 white. You can unequip it to tutor for a red or white instant card with converted mana cost 4 or less, and play that card without paying its mana cost. Then shuffle your library. So it allows you to search for answers that you may need to either deal with threat on the table, or just maybe you're looking for something to deal extra damage. It's just a really great card. And then last but not least, we have Well of Lost Dreams, probably the best draw engine in this deck. It costs 4, and whenever you gain life, you may pay X, where X is less than or equal to the amount of life you gained, and then if you do, you draw that many cards. And since we're life linking our spells, we could draw quite a few cards with this, and it's just a good way to get through your deck. Next up, we're going to take a look at the enchantments, and again, the enchantments in here are pretty spicy. Starting with Dawn of Hope. For 1 and a white, whenever you gain a life, you can pay 2. If you do, draw a card. So again, we're just trying to put as much in here to draw cards as possible, because if we have any issues with this deck, it's just being able to draw cards. You can also pay 3 and a white to create a 1/1 soldier creature token with lifelink, so it's decent. Good for chump blocking. You get the lifelink. Just helps bolster your life total. Next up, we have Dictate of the Twin Gods, 3 and 2 red for an enchantment with flash. If a source would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. It's kind of like a Furnace of Wrath, but a little bit more expensive because it has flash. Next up, we have Double Vision, 5. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, each turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for it. So it's an enchantment that basically copies your instant and sorcery spells, which is super good for this deck. Then we have Fiery Emancipation, 3 and 3 red. If a source would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals triple that damage to that permanent or player. So this I chose to run instead of Furnace of Wrath. Furnace of Wrath is 1 and 3 red to do this ability, except it's doubled. So instead of doubling it, we're going to look at tripling it for an extra 2 more mana. I just think it's a better card. It costs more, but tripling versus doubling, I don't know. In this deck, we really want to see that tripling. Next, we have Land Tax. So Land Tax is in here because, again, white and red are notorious for having very little in the way of ramping. Obviously we have a rocks and we have any rituals, so obviously the Mana Geyser is a good one. Even Torch Song would be good, but when we need something more consistent, we have things like Land Tax. During your upkeep, if an opponent controls more lands than you, you may search your library and remove up to 3 basic lands, put them into your hand, and shuffle your library afterwards. So you tutor for 3 lands, it guarantees you're going to get your land drops, and if you are not the first player to go, then you're almost always going to have less lands at the beginning of your upkeep than your opponents. Now, if they start missing land drops, that's going to turn this off. But Land Tax early game, super good. Next, we have Mark of Asylum. It's 1 and a white for an enchantment that says prevent all non-combat damage that would be dealt to creatures you control. So it protects you from all the board wipes that we have in here. All that nonsense that deals 13 damage, 20 damage, X damage to each creature, Mark of Asylum will protect you from that. Unfortunately, you still take combat damage, but it is what it is. Then we have Repercussion. Repercussion says whenever a creature is dealt damage, Repercussion deals that much damage to that creature's controller. So it kind of turns the table where we have Brash Taunter that when it takes damage, deals that much damage to target opponent. Repercussion makes it so that all of your opponent's creatures and your own deal damage to you or whoever they are controlled by, equal to the amount of damage they're taking. So if we throw out, again, a Star of Extinction, they're going to take 20 damage for each creature that took 20 damage. They could easily close out a game. Next up, we have Smothering Tithe. Smothering Tithe is in here for obvious reasons. Whenever an opponent draws a card, unless they pay 2, you get to create a treasure token. As I mentioned before, we're trying to create big mana in here. It's extremely important that we basically save up as many treasures as possible, pop them for an X spell, and deal as much damage as possible. And last, we have Underworld Breach, which I talked about earlier. For 1 and a red, each non-land card in your graveyard has escape. The escape cost is equal to that card's mana cost, plus exile 3 cards from your graveyard. And then at the beginning of your end step, sacrifice Underworld Breach. So for 1 turn, you can reoccur important spells in your graveyard, but really what it's in here for is that Jessica's Will. So we can reoccur the Jessica's Will as many times as we can and get as much mana as possible to dump into a massive spell. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Planeswalkers. There's only one. We have Jaya Ballard in here. She costs 5, 2 and 3 red. Her first +1 is to add 3 red mana, and you can spend this mana to cast instant or sorcery spells. So it's exactly what we're looking for in this deck. And then her second +1 is to discard up to 3 cards, and then draw that many cards. So if you're stuck and you really need to filter through your hand, great way to get more cards. And then for -8, you get an emblem that says you may cast an instant or sorcery spell, instant or sorcery cards from your graveyard. If a card is cast this way, it would be put into the graveyard, exile instead. So you get flashback on all your instants and sorceries once you get her emblem, which is so good in this deck. Next, we're going to look at the non-basic lands. There's quite a few interesting ones in here, but a lot of it's just mana fixing. The first and most important we got here is Ancient Tomb. Ancient Tomb can tap for 2 colorless mana, and when you do that, it deals 2 damage to you. We're not too worried about the 2 damage because of all the abilities to gain life in here. We do need that extra 2 colorless mana. It just helps to add more punch to X spells. Next, we have Arch of Arazga. Typically, it just taps for colorless mana, but it has Ascend, so if you do have 10 or more permanents in play, you have the City's Blessing. You can tap 5 and it to draw a card. It's not the most efficient way to draw cards, but again, with red and white having such a difficult time drawing cards, this is a fantastic way to get 1 extra card if you need it. Next up, we have Arid Mesa. It's the red-white fetch land. Battlefield Forge, red-white pain land. Boros Garrison, red-white bounce land. Clifftop Retreat is red-white check land, checks for mountains or plains. Command Tower, because, when we're running anything over 1 color, Command Tower is just super good. Evolving Wilds to search for, basic land that you need. Fabled Passage, same thing. Needlespire, red-white manland. Sacred Foundry, red-white shockland. Spectator Seating, red-white crowdland. Sundown Pass, another red-white checkland that checks for 2 or more other lands in play. Temple of Triumph is the red-white scryland. And last but not least, we have Windscarred Crag, which is the red-white life gain land. And then finally, our basic lands. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 mountains, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plains. So that is the Firesong and Sunspeaker Spellslinger deck. Again, as I've mentioned multiple times during this recording, the idea is to get huge amounts of mana and burn your opponents with big X spells to gain super huge amounts of life, and then either win with the Felidar Sovereign or the Aetherflux Reservoir or some version of Repercussion with an X spell. Just outright burning your opponents to death. Yeah, if you have any questions or comments, please leave those down below. And that's pretty much it, guys. Until next time, peace.